Go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2. I've been hinting at some of the things we're going to be covering in this particular text, and the defensiveness sometimes we have to take, which is interesting to me because there was a defensiveness, and I think sometimes it's warranted. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's negative or we should never take a defensive posture, at least at some part in the text. And the reason we do that is because of how often a text is mishandled. And often a text is mishandled in a variety of ways. Either it's misinterpreted, or it's generally explained and then twisted, or there's the wrong emphasis, or the emphasis is taken away. There's a multitude of ways to mishandle a text. And a lot of people think, well, it's just a practical thing. I mean, you're dealing with people, and we don't want to be unnecessarily offensive, which I would agree in theory. The problem is that what determines unnecessary when it comes to offense? If our goal is to say what the text says, we say what the text says, even though there will be a reaction. I mentioned that I had talked about this in another text with another pastor a few years ago, and we were reviewing some of this, and for a particular reason that I won't get into, but he seemed taken aback that I still take them at face value. And you really think this? And it basically came down to, you really think women should be quiet during the church service? And I said, yes. And you really think that women can't stand in front of the congregation during church and teach or speak? Do you really believe that? And I said, yes. And I said, because the text clearly states it. And I understand the way you're trying to work around it. We went back and forth over this for a little bit. But I said, I couldn't do this in good conscience. But it just won't work. There's just no way that's ever going to be received. That is never a criteria for what impacts our handling of a text. It better not be. I am fully aware that there are certain texts out there, like we dealt with in 1 Timothy 2 toward the beginning, that have been historically offensive to people. And the text we're getting into now has been historically, and not that long ago, and even to this day, offensive. And then when I go to other ministers, some that I respect, and I listen to some of their handling of it, it's almost the way out is let's put it over into the cultural handling and say it's a cultural handling of this, and this was more Paul's opinion, or it was a particular issue in Corinth and in Ephesus, but not for the whole church. And these are creative answers, and there might be every once in a while a proper use of those concepts in a text, but not these texts. There's no hint that any of that was the case. So a lot of people say, so you're just going to come out and say that and offend women in general? Because it sure sounds offensive. I mean, how do you say this in a polished way that when you start the church, and I'll try to make it clear the logistics of this. I don't think it means as soon as you walk in the building, you can't say anything. Certainly, we wouldn't include that in the singing because women sing, and we wouldn't strongly encourage it. It has everything to do because of the context, especially that Paul is setting up with Timothy during the church preaching, teaching, exhortation time is when it starts. And some people recognize that many of the women that have practiced head coverings based out of 1 Corinthians 11 oftentimes acknowledge that point because they'll wait. I've seen it. They'll wait until the singing announcements and all this other stuff is done, and then they'll put on their head coverings for the church service. I think there's some legitimacy as far as the timing is concerned and acknowledging in what segment are we talking about. But that should then force us to the next stage, and that is, then why are we doing this? Why is this an issue? Why is it set up this way? And Paul answers it to Timothy. The problem, of course, you know where this is going. The problem is people don't like the answer. And it just doesn't fit our society. How will we ever get people to take us serious if we hold this position? Because doesn't it demean women? Doesn't it put them down? Doesn't it degrade them? Doesn't it make them lesser? And the answer is absolutely not. We have such a warped society based on so many of the wrong things that our value system is messed up as well. We have roles throughout society, roles throughout life, and I understand our society is trying as fervently as possible to blur it. And in our study in biblical foundations, we more than speculated on what would be the cause there. I still think fundamentally that's caused by society wanting to cast off God's norms. God has a set of norms, and mankind instinctively, as the by birth enemies of God, will try to distort it any way we can. We've seen it fervently done with the trying to blur the lines of the sexes. They'll call it gender, but gender is still more or less a grammatical reference to the sexes. It always bothers me that logistic is missed. There's not these multiple transgender ideas there that society has tried to push. So that was certainly a big one. I still think the core of that, whether they know it or not, they don't have to know it, is they just want to mess up God's norms. Now, it's even been attempted in the past to mess up the 7-day work week or how we measure time. That has been messed with, as it were, by different societies. There's all kinds of things. So the roles of the sexes in the church is what is being discussed here. Not the role of the sexes in society, but the role of the sexes in church, and for the reasons that are going to be given, whether or not when we get through it, we agree with it. I would be very cautious, and I would hope we all would be cautious in a reverential sense, if we ever get to the point where we think, I just don't agree with that text. Now, we might not phrase it that way. We might say, I don't agree with that handling of that text. But we want to make sure if we're going to disagree, we're not actually disagreeing with the text itself. None of us has the responsibility to fully explain to everyone's satisfaction the meaning and handling and application of every text. Do we try? Absolutely. But none of us owns that responsibility. Just because someone walks away and says, I still don't get it, I'm still not convinced, that somehow values the presentation of a text or values a handling of a whole context or something like that. That's not how we measure these things. We want to see what it says, and there will be different times where we'll get through, and for us individually, we'll think, I still don't fully get it all. But to have an expectation that we'll somehow fully get it all is also arrogant and not grounded in faith. I was talking again with my brother David, and just part of the context, I say this often here, but it's almost as though people have forgotten the last part of the definition of faith in Hebrews 11:1. People will quote it, people will talk about it, and then totally act as though it doesn't end the way that it does. You know what I'm talking about, the evidence of things not seen, which is a fine translation. But who likes that? The evidence of things not seen. There's just not the evidence, however we want to define the evidence, it just isn't there. And I'm never going to have an answer that would suffice me as I think I would be sufficed in any of this. And there's the problem. None of us actually knows. I firmly believe this. None of us actually knows what it would take to make any of us believe something. We don't know. We think we do. We think we do. Have you ever had someone and you really question something and they give you evidence? And we think, no, I'm questioning the evidence now. I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't see the study done. Or I just don't agree. I don't think practically that's going to work. We have all these different fighting off faith instincts that we have. And sadly, they've crept into the church solidly. Where now we come and we're here in the church saying, you go ahead, convince me. Which we try to do, obviously. But it's what we consider the core of the standard by which we're going to be convinced and if we're satisfied with it. And that's what's made me ill almost over the years, to watch how people value the handling of a text or the church in general based upon how they feel about something. And they trust their feelings and their instincts too strongly and end up going for the more shallow, the more tickle my ears approach, which Paul, of course, warned Timothy against in 2 Timothy chapter 3. In the notes, we're toward the top of page 13. Women during, and I put in quotes, church. I think we all realize, hopefully, that this does not mean the church building, but church service itself and their decorum. I think that's a fine word to describe what's being dealt with here, because we've already been dealing with men and their role in the church and their decorum, and especially when it comes to praying in the church. And it doesn't stop there with men, obviously. It's going to get into chapter 3, the roles of the deacons and the elders and what qualifications are. It's going to narrow it down even more. So as I've already mentioned over the last week or so, that it's not just pick on women. Most men will not have a leadership role in a church service, in the church hierarchy. Most men won't. Not because most men aren't good, generally speaking, or most men aren't saved in the church. None of that's even alluded to. It's just that there are certain criteria given for those who have a spiritual leadership role in the church. Should every man be a spiritual leader in his home? Absolutely. Should a man be a spiritual leader amongst his friends? Absolutely. And any of the influences out there. As I've stressed also, the bulk of our time in our Christian walk is spent outside of these times. The overwhelming majority of our Christian walk and our obedience and our service is spent outside of these times. This is why it frustrates me. So much focus is put on these times in an undue way. It is very important. Obviously, it is. It is very important for what we use it for and what we're supposed to use it for. But most of our Christian walk is done outside these walls. And we need to keep that in focus. So to define our value based on I am not able to have some position in the corporate church, the organized church, the local church, or I can't even speak during the services, that somehow then defines the value or the scope of our Christian walk is not reasonable. Now, even on human terms, I don't think it's reasonable to think that way. So let's read the context here. Verse 9, likewise, is the first word. It ties it back to, I urge that entreaties and prayers be made for all men, all the way back in verse 1. So this is likewise. This is something else that's being urged, insisted upon in the church itself. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but, now this is a contrast, but by means of good works, that this is their focus, by means of good works, as is proper for women, making a claim to godliness. This is where your focus is going to be. Does it mean women can't braid their hair? It's oftentimes the first question. No, that's not the point of the text. This is not what their beauty, their godliness, their adornment is supposed to be made up of. Their adornment, their beauty, their organization, we'll get into the underlying words here in just a bit, are to be made up of their godliness, as those who claim to godliness. Their conduct, their character, things like that, their obedience, their faith. All of these things are to be key, and it's often downplayed in 1 Peter 3, and yet it's elevated, even though a lot of people push back, not just women, but some men, there in 1 Peter 3, how a woman wins over her disobedient husband through her character, her good works, without having to say a word, is how it's. And again, so many people think it just isn't going to work. That would certainly never work in a counseling session. It would never work there. That's just not practical. How could it possibly be that case? Again, I have seen grimaced faces in certain counseling sessions some time back, bringing up 1 Peter 3. Like, there's just no way. There's just no, don't you dare even bring up that text. And don't ever use the word submit or anything, as though somehow it's just a patriarchal, male-dominated attempt to rein women in. No doubt it's been used that way. I've seen the exaggerated handling of a text like we're about to deal now superimposed on society in general, where all men are over all women. You're not going to get that from this text, nor the text in 1 Corinthians 11. Or that somehow, of course, God set it up this way, some of my favorites, because women are just more emotional, and they're not as rational and logical, and they're not as intelligent as men. All of these ridiculous arguments that are brought out there. We can speculate on why. We don't need to, because we're told why. And we're told why as regards the church itself. And that's very important for us to keep in mind. I'm certainly not against women and downplaying women. I'm obviously married to a woman, and Tammy is no unintelligent, over-emotional person. I have 8 daughters, and I don't look on my daughters as being more weak as far as their intellect is concerned, and overcome with their emotionalism, or not as smart as men in general. Again, I think theologically my daughters could handle themselves against a lot of people out there, a lot of men, even in seminaries, I would say. So what am I supposed to do with that? Well, it's just wasted then. It's wasted if they can't speak. And then, no, it's not. Absolutely not. The reason we structure our services the way we do is because we're told to. And this is foundational to first century, how the church was set up and why the role of women is what it is in contrast to the role of men in the church. And not all men even in the church, as we'll build on as we work our way forward. So then, verse 11, a woman must quietly receive instruction with entire submissiveness. But I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. Now, quietness is stressed twice there. This is in the church service. We know that by the context starting at the beginning here of chapter 2. We know what this is talking about. But quietness is mentioned there twice. I don't think we have to get into too many details. Well, does that mean they could whisper an answer? Just the ridiculous things that sometimes people will try to work around the meaning of a text to somehow soften the blow, as it were, to others. Verse 13, as if it didn't get controversial enough. Verse 13, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. Anyone want to dispute that? No. There's a reason for it. And why then that has an impact on the church service. And it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. But women will be preserved through the bearing of children if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint. And a lot of people will look at a verse like that and think, what do we do with that? How do we handle that? Not all women have children. So does that mean women are trying to react, as so many people like to do when they don't like the premise of a text? So they'll overreact to somehow make us change the normal meaning? So does that mean a woman who doesn't have a child isn't saved? She's not sanctified? No. We'll build on this more as to exactly what this is talking about and why it's used in this particular context the way that it is. This, if ever we needed to cling to one, we ought to cling to all of them, but one of the rules of hermeneutics, it is certainly during this time, context is king, is very, very important for us to not lose sight of. The context of this text. It has been reacted to and misused in more than one way. So let's just dive into this and deal with it as close as we can to what it's just plainly saying. How women should dress, first of all, in church. How they should dress. How does it say they should attire themselves? And the why is also dealt with here. Just to try to deal with some of the reactions to it. Number one, these verses 9 through 15 have become controversial and provocative as far as anger and emotional responses are concerned by all types of people, often approached as though they are antiquated, that it's just strictly some ancient culture idea, or, okay, maybe back in the 1800s or 1700s or something like that, as though they're antiquated, as if motivated by a time when male domination, a patriarchy of sorts, was acceptable by society, they might say. Back then, but well, we're enlightened that we no longer have anything like that. If anything, it should be the opposite. As we're seeing people react, that men now are the lesser ones, that somehow if we can counteract what we believe to have been a misuse of this throughout history, we're going to make it even out, which is, of course, even philosophically and intellectually absurd to think about. That because something was misused in the past, if we overreact the other way, it balances it out. It doesn't do that. I think that's part of the motive here. But clearly, this was an issue in the first century. And why was it an issue in the first century? I'm about to build on this in a moment, but if men were just the natural dominant ones and women were automatically just considered submissive across the board, why was this an issue in the first century church? Unless, of course, just speculate a little bit, and it's not speculation, but unless, of course, in the first century, no, women weren't quite as second class as a lot of people like to put it out to be. That they were more enlightened like our society thinks it was. That's one of the reasons why this had to be brought up here, as well as 1 Corinthians 14. Point A underneath that, this take on these verses, as far as that it's antiquated or just put together by a bunch of dominating males, this take on these verses, or many other such takes, often fail to consider, first of all, that the role and status of women during Paul's time was not as oppressive as many assume, and that's historically provable. It's not as oppressive as many assume. There were plenty of predominant women of great influence, even those that helped the church itself, as we dealt with even last week, even helping the church be housed somewhere. Plenty of roles of women early on in that, or in the first century, which is why Paul had to deal with these concerns here, and as I mentioned, with the church at Corinth, because there was an issue of, okay, women have a more free role out there than some cultures had. They were more prominent in certain circles, many of them in leadership roles. So why is Paul having to deal with it? To say, but not in the church service. Not in the church service. And there's a reason, or reasons why that's the case. Off to the left, just to keep it in focus here, this is no more belittling of women than the text to deal with the proper decorum of men. That's not belittling men. Both are to be in a submissive, obedient posture before the head of the church, Christ. And are we going to be so naive as to think that obedience isn't going to be a challenge for all of us at times? This isn't the only text that people question whether or not we should take it literally and obey it strictly. There are plenty of texts people just don't want to hear because it involves obedience. Again, still thinking about some of my conversation yesterday, something I mentioned toward the beginning. A lot of people would just as soon come to a church on a regular basis that hits all the hot topics and constantly flexing and moving with all the philosophical, intellectual debates of the day and in the churches, and it just keeps everybody on the cutting edge of things, and people, that's what I like, that's what I want to hear. One of my thoughts as to a motive for that is because I do believe we instinctively know what happens if we do just go through text after text after text. It requires obedience. It requires responsibility. It's not always fun. It's like more work, more faith, more submission on my part. And people love to look religious, love to talk religiously and theologically, just love to hash these things out. But start to squirm when it comes to day-to-day obedience. Day-to-day practical faith. Because it's hard. I don't want to hear it. I'd love to discuss what's wrong with all the other churches out there. I love to discuss what's wrong with the theologies that are gripping our society and gripping our churches, and just spend our time on that so we can nail it down. But it's getting bored with all this other stuff, and then there's this, and then there's that, and then there's this. And yet this is exactly how it was laid out by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. If we truly revere the Lord himself, then we're certainly going to go at it and take it like it was given and trust that regardless of our feelings or our natural interests at any given time. And texts like this are certainly one that demonstrate where we're at on our approach to Scripture. So that was one thing. Back there in that first century, it was not necessarily as oppressive as many might think. Was there oppression going on? Sure there was. There always has been in any culture. Point B, second, this is far more than cultural norms, a cultural norm setting. It's more than that. But instead, it lays out the actual order and structure of the Lord for his church in its assembling. That's how it was laid out. One of the other texts that's similar to this is Titus chapter 2. We know that not too long ago. Titus chapter 2. We'll start at verse 1. Again, Titus, a pastor, helping set up a church there in Crete or helping maintain it, also being given instruction on how the church is to be set up and run. Verse 1 of Titus 2, but as for you, speak the things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Older men are to be temperate, dignified, sensible, sound in faith, in love, in perseverance. Those are things that are required. They're no less emphasized than what the role of women ought to be. And in some sense, I'm a little concerned that characteristics and qualities like that aren't controversial today. Would men resist being held to this? Older men in particular? Be held to this? It must have been an issue if it had to be brought up. Temperate, the controlled area, dignified, sensible, sound in faith and love and perseverance. Then verse 3, older women, likewise, are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine. And then in contrast to those addictive things, teaching what is good. Okay, there is a teaching role clearly somehow, so that they may encourage the young women to love their husbands. That's the very first thing that's given. That Paul is laying out to Titus to pass on. The older women are to be controlled, not given over to these other substance things, not malicious gossips, but teachers of good things, and in particular, teachers of young women. And what's the topic? To love their husbands, which I have seen, at least in varying degrees, responses to this particular text over the years, almost as though it's being laughed at. To love their husbands, that's what older women are supposed. Is that only older married women? I didn't say that. It's older women in general. And what's one of the top priorities? If you have a husband, love him. Love him. Now, pulling back a moment into the realm of practicality in our day, as enlightened as we are, do we think this is still a need? Yes. If anything that characterizes even our churches, and I'm not just picking on women, it certainly fits with men as well, but if anything characterizes, sadly, our churches, it's the lack of love of husbands. And the reverential thing there that's mentioned here, as well as in Ephesians 5, is often mocked and laughed at. I remember talking to a woman at work who claimed to be a believer, and we were talking about these things, and she had all kinds of issues with her husband and was the opposite of what she should be, and I brought up the reverential text and the loving the husband, and it was constantly countered with, but this and but that. And there are practical reasons why. How could I teach women to love their husbands? Well, number one, it's not a how, it's you must. And what would that love involve? And there's plenty of texts that tell us what that love involves. So this is what they're told to do. Love their husbands, to love their children. We wish we could just say, but that's instinctive. But we're clearly saying, and it's been on the scene long before any of us came around, that women oftentimes just don't love their children. Many don't love children at all. They just don't love their children. And I think we could make a case for this, though it's not in the context here, but how unnatural that is. How against God's design that is. And there's a variety of reasons why so many times women just don't love children. We can say, well, a lot of children aren't well behaved. I don't see a condition put here. Sadly, a lot of times a lot of children aren't well behaved over a long period of time because they're not loved. That's why. So if anything, when you see out of control, rebellious, sometimes children, it's thinking, well, I clearly see one of the categories in what our older women need to do in teaching the younger women is what this love involves. And clearly, one of the things it involves is discipline, consistent discipline of children. Rather than this other, we want our children to be our best friends. And we've certainly seen plenty of people that have had children, and it's almost as though their goal to have children is to have some kind of decor to their life, someone to support them, someone to love them. That's a horrible reason to have kids. You might be fortunate once in a while to have some type of response like that with children, but that's not our goal. We love them, and it's a selflessness that ought to be carried on and taught. To be sensible, just like the men, older men were to be sensible, pure, so not immoral in any way, workers at home, that one gets eyebrows raised often, kind, being subject to their own husbands, so that the word of God will not be dishonored. That's the reason. Interesting reason given there, isn't it? Why they're submissive to their husbands, so that the word of God is not dishonored. Goes on to then the young men are told what they're supposed to be, and then on it goes, and with the different roles there. Point C, the so-called liberation movements that we've seen throughout history, liberation movements of women in history, ought not be seen as necessary because of texts like these. Sadly, they've been associated, the oppressiveness of men. Now, could a case be made that men in history have been oppressive to women? Sure. Absolutely, you can make a case. But what's the response? Well, since men have historically been oppressive to women because of sin, because of their lack of accountability before the Creator, God has not given them the right to be oppressive to women. But because people will oftentimes think this, then they'll take a text like this and say, well, clearly that falls under the category of oppression. And therefore, when we talk about the liberation and freedom and the rights of women, we have to throw in a text like this and say, clearly that cannot be held to. It can't be, because it's oppressive. It's not at all oppressive. Any text could be taken as oppressive depending on how we look on it. Any responsibility that's given to any of us could be looked upon as oppressive depending on how we look on it. I'm told to do something, even the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek. Who wants to be meek? Especially when you understand what it is and you'll inherit the earth. Well, when's that going to happen? And who wants to be poor and poor in spirit? This is oppressive. This is demeaning to me. I'm just meekness and poor in spirit. You throw both of those together, and this just seems to belittle me and my self-worth. And my being able to compare myself with other people and finding some value there. Oh, any text could be looked on as oppressive. And therefore, we don't look on it from a personal perspective first. When we get to the personal, it's after we understand what the text says, and then we're going to apply it in obedience. So the liberation movements of women in history ought not be seen as necessary because of texts like this. And so only for other cultural, societal reason of appropriateness, then fine, deal with it there as it ought to be, but don't throw this text in the mix as though somehow it is oppressive. Though it has been, even in our churches, these verses and others are organizational. They are organizational. Not trying to skirt around the issue. It's exactly what they are. They are organizational and to be followed carefully. To be followed carefully, just like any organizational structure God has set up. As when we get into 1 Timothy 3, they ought to be followed carefully. Too many churches put into spiritual leadership roles men who are not qualified. Not because we determine what's qualifications or not, but the qualifications that are given here. So we're thinking, well, how are we going to know? I suppose we're going to study them carefully, right? We're going to look at the words that describe the roles and the responsibilities and what's to describe these men. And then we're going to apply them carefully. I've had it in the past where different men have kind of hinted at, well, I think I should be a leader here in this church. But it's more than just say, well, I don't want to lose you and I don't want to lose your money either, so let's bring you on. Sadly, that happens in churches. they'll bring them on. A lot of boards, ministry boards, will bring on people because of their influence in society, their money. We need to bring them on. No. I think if we're any association at all with the work of Christ, we ought to be as careful as we possibly can in leadership roles, like texts that are given here. Just as with men, women do not find their true value in cultural or societal positions, either elevated unnecessarily high or lowered unnecessarily low. None of us finds our value, our actual value, because of what culture or society says. It would do us well to remember that. Too many think they are. Well, society says I'm a woman and I need to be liberated and I need to be able to express my thoughts anytime, anywhere, which, by the way, is not true with anybody. That's not true with anybody in any circumstance. And yet it's often put out there. And we think, well, then, boy, we better just skip over that part of 1 Timothy 2. Because it's just, or when we get to it, we'll be as apologetic as we can and say, it's not applicable for today. You women, don't worry about it. It's not going to be a case. We're up with the times like anybody else. And that was just a cultural thing back in their day. Even if it was a cultural thing, I don't understand how they use that to lessen the clearness of the commands that are given here. Instead, our value is where? This cannot be overstated. In their position in Christ and their callings in it, there is no too little, too low of a position in Christ. It does not exist. It doesn't. We oftentimes allow that thought to be out there, that there are the prestigious positions and there are the not so prestigious positions. That is non-existent in the work of Christ. Anything done for the infinite God of the universe is of infinite value. Anything, even if nobody is impressed, even if nobody notices. Again, we deal with this all the time because it's a constant challenge on our part. I just don't feel value. I don't think I'm doing anything important. Are you obeying whatever God gives you at any given time? Absolutely. Then there's nothing higher you could aspire to do. That's a fact. And we'd better come to grips with that. We're all to be busy about the work of the Lord, and if it doesn't happen to be associated with a corporate church that meets a few hours a week, so be it. It doesn't have to be. And just because someone is in a speaking position in a church, it doesn't mean they are more prestigious or more important. It doesn't mean that. But that's a hard one to fight off because of society's influence there. Our true value is not by culture, but in our position in Christ and our callings in it. Purpose and value is set by our Creator. They're set by His values. They're set by His designs. He knew exactly what He was doing in His infinite wisdom, His omniscience, in making us who and what we are. Male or female, even. Imagine that. He knew exactly what He was doing. But people don't realize what a flagrant, arrogant reaction against God when they say, I think I should have been a man. I should have been a woman. That is grossly dishonoring of the Creator, as though He didn't know what He was doing. I get it why society does that. Again, they are instinctively the enemies of God and will do anything they can to somehow thwart it. It's amazing how when this trend took off in our society, how suddenly the statistics skyrocketed and how many boys thought they should be girls and girls thought they should be boys, and suddenly it was just all over the place. And then people embracing, what a wonderful thing, how we're going to be liberated from this. But that's just characteristic of how mankind is in all areas, including this. I don't doubt a lot of people looked on that and frowned and thought, that is wicked and evil. And then they hear, boy, did you hear that church over there won't let women speak in the church services? Oh, that's just horrible. That's wicked. That's evil, they might say. All defined by their own perspective, not in faith. God did not limit us by making us what He made us. Any of us could criticize, or, we could feel free to criticize God's design of us. It would be easy to do. Like a lot of guys, maybe I could have been a foot taller. Even though I know I make fun of you tall guys just to make myself feel better, I guess. I could have been a foot taller. I could have had a more commanding presence. in something like that. I could have been, more physically. It's all these things we can come up with. And yet, God knew exactly what he was doing. Psalm 19 is such a precious, precious psalm for so many reasons. One reason in particular, he knew ahead of time because he designed every detail of our physical being as well. Every detail. Every part of my members, everything, including the DNA, including when I finally left my prime age, whatever that happens to be, and start to get older, what happens? Yeah, he designed that also. So we'd better be very critical when we even criticize our own selves and God's design of us. It's easy. We don't connect the dots like we should. And we start to criticize things. If Proverbs warns against mocking the poor, because if you do, you mock their creator, I think that still practically applies when we mock ourselves. Because who made us? Who designed us in these things? It's very important for us to keep in mind. It's easy for us to get off track with these things. Our purpose and value is already set by my Creator, and that's the highest value I can focus on, and his design of us, including my sex. Off to the left, those who let a society define their worth by a temporal, even a godless standard will never find lasting fulfillment in reaching the upper echelon of such societies. How do I say that? They will never find lasting, true satisfaction, even when they are impressive to society, because they're going against their Creator's design. He's the one that designed us to how contentment will actually be found, how joy will actually be had. Any sense of fulfillment, he knows he's our Creator. So for me to think, well, that's not, I look at that text and that would be unsatisfying to me. I would not be content if I subscribed to that. Who are we actually arguing against? What makes me so smart? My Creator knows me far better than I know myself. Therefore, I don't understand why we give such credence to our own criticisms of, I don't like the way God made me. I don't like the position he put me in. I know I would have been better in such and such another thing. Well, if we think that way now, if somehow we could make that happen, we would be discontent if we got what we wanted. Because we don't actually know what we want. We don't actually know. We think we do, but we don't know what we want. As so often demonstrated that we can find such lasting fulfillment in areas where, for honest, we will have to admit God forced us into it. There's plenty of things that emotionally I've gone kicking and screaming into, but have found so much lasting fulfillment on the other side because God knew what he was doing. He did not yield to my demands. He did not yield to my prayers for release from whatever this was. He knew what he was doing in his infinite wisdom. So I'm trying to set up this so that there's no question at all when we look at these texts, we're thinking, then absolutely. Society will laugh at this. Many churches will disagree with this, but it's what the text says. First up, how they dress. Adorn themselves with proper clothing. The Net Bible translated that suitable apparel. And people will say, that sounds subjective. What's suitable? Well, we're going to get into it. What it is and what it isn't. It's very important we handle that correctly. Point A, it must be noted first that these verses do not describe dull and drab clothing. I wanted to say that right off, because some people say, I know where this is going. You're going to tell me, and it sure seems to be what a lot of people taking it as, that a woman coming to church must be as dull as she possibly can be. That's what it means. That is absolutely false. That's not true at all. It's just that her adornment of what really is going to demonstrate her godliness is going to be her character, her life. That is the stress point in this text. And some of the underlying words here also don't communicate dull or drab at all. I know, because I've been affiliated in a peripheral way with some denominations that have done just that. That it is almost as though you cannot, if the color's a little too bright or, the hair's a little too fancy or whatever, then you can't possibly come to church that way. And the whole makeup debate, which I'm not going to take a firm stance on that is often brought up in this, that women should never wear makeup, and the big debate there. And it's a misuse of a text like this, that somehow there's something noble if a woman can look as dull and drab and as unattractive as possible. That means she's holier than someone else. That is absolutely not at all the meaning of this text. Can a woman overdo it? Sure. Which is part of the meaning of the text here, the overdoing it. It must be noted first that this is not described dull and drab clothing. We do not read too much into this, but the word for adorn, she is to adorn herself, is cosmeo. Now, don't think I'm going to stretch and say, oh, there, she's to use cosmetics. No, it's not what the text means. But it is the underlying, which, by the way, variations of cosmeo are used in this text. But the idea there of adorn is cosmeo, describing primarily orderly and neat. She's to be very ordered in her attire and neat. This, quote, cosmetic, though, must not be immodest. This cosmetic, this appearance must not be immodest, and I mean that in the full sense of the normal English word immodest. Immodest doesn't mean just that she doesn't wear enough clothing. That would certainly be immodest. But immodest can mean you're drawing undue attention to yourself, that overdoing it with something. I mean, I'm not against makeup, but it can be overdone. I'm not against very nice clothing, but it can be overdone. And one of the historical resources I was looking into with this was, it was very common in that culture, just like it is today, to want to show off your wealth and standing by what you wore. So it might be perfectly modest when it comes to enough of you is covered, but it may be immodest because it just screams, look how wealthy I am. Look how wealthy I am. Even the silver and gold braided in the hair. Look at my wealth. Look how well-to-do I am, and you other people out there, not as well-to-do as I am. You clearly don't wear the nicest clothes like I do. You're not as adorned as well as I am. That's exactly what Paul is going against as part of the handling of this text. That would be very immodest, where you're coming in such a way as to so elevate yourself, others are put down by it. And that's never to be our objective with any of this, in which goes to the heart of then why women dress the way they do in the church. They are not to be immodest in the actual meaning of the word. Don't draw undue attention to yourself by what you wear or by what you don't wear. That's not the goal. There can be a general standard that's found there. That's fine. And that's what we're looking for. But don't be gaudy, I think it's a term that could be used. You just walk in and wow. You ever been in a situation where everyone is trying to outdo each other? At least it's what we think it is. And it's almost overwhelming to see the variety of things that are going on, and everyone comes to church and it's to show off their latest fashion or their latest style or whatever to outdo others. Okay, nothing wrong at all with dressing neatly, nicely, in an organized fashion and looking the best you can, honoring what God has given you, and by attiring yourself as nicely as possible. This point B, likewise, that Paul starts this section with demonstrating the continuation of the I want there in verse 8, a few verses back. Here, women are, that two shouldn't be there, women are given a few words describing how they adorn themselves. So there's a few words now how this adornment, this cosmeo, was done, and that with more than just clothing. That's, if really you wanted to run away with this text, the point is, don't let your beauty and your demonstration of who you are be in what you wear. Let it be in how you conduct yourself. That's, I think, a great summation of where this is headed. So it's describing how they adorn themselves, and with more than what just their clothing is, but to be with their overall demeanor. Off to the left, as men, because in the context we were just dealing with, as men are not to be a public distraction and bad example in unholiness or in their self-righteous anger, so women are not to be a distraction with any type of self-focused vanity. These services are for the edification of the body and glorifying of the Lord. That's what they're for. So don't be a distraction. I was thinking about this text, but the person that prompted this thinking in a Facebook post I was looking at was a man. He's an evangelist. I don't know how I got on his Facebook stuff, but I'm there. And he wears the wildest clothing ever. And he's an old-time evangelist. Associates himself with the old-time evangelist. And he has just the wildest suits and suit jackets ever. And I kind of look on that and think, I just think that someone needs to come alongside and say, you know, your suit jacket's speaking louder than you are. Maybe you should back it off a little bit there. Could I be wrong in my read? I suppose I could be, but it just screams at you when you see something like this. So this immodesty can be with any of us. Just don't overdo it. Back to the notes here. I started that point off to the left there. Not to be a distraction in any of this, certainly not with self-focused vanity. These services are for the edification of the body and the glorifying of the Lord, not for the glorifying of ourselves. So if I walk into a church and I am more noticed and outdo the Lord himself as the focus, something's dreadfully wrong. Very, very wrong. So point C, their clothing is to be proper. Look at the underlying word for proper there. Cosmos. Like from cosmeo, that orderliness, that neatness. Their clothing is to be proper, the same word for adorn, meaning orderly, respectable, and appropriate to the situation. Appropriate to the situation. That's where we're getting at. Could this be overdone? I suppose so. But if we're going to err, we err on the side of caution. This would be the opposite of inappropriate, but more precisely, it is not, it should say, it is not gaudy or extravagant. It doesn't say, look at me. Just look at me. I think there's a neatness, a nice cleanness about how we can adorn ourselves and conduct ourselves, but not over the top with these things. This is not an inordinate handling of the clothing issue, realizing that the external, though not the most important, and it's not, though not the most important, it still is important, and it is what others see or perceive about us first. There is a sense in which it is very responsible to dress for what others will see. Hopefully, though, in a modest, reverential, God-honoring way. We dress ourselves, we look in a mirror, but the reality is, throughout the day, we don't see ourselves. I don't know if my hair is sticking up or anything. I don't know if my tie is askew or not. We try to do the best we can, not to be an unnecessary distraction in any possible way, especially with drawing too much attention to ourselves, and that is fitting for, it's obviously fitting to this text with women here, so that they're to dress appropriately, neatly, orderly, not drawing undue attention. With modesty, which also fits then, that not undue attention. From eidos, a word picturing a looking down, as in not looking to be noticed. It's a word picture, eidos. You walk in and they're not looking in the eye, they're kind of looking down. They're not arrogant. They're not, hey, look at me. They're not, I'm going to challenge you type of look, or something like that. That's the underlying idea with eidos. It's a looking down. As if to not be noticed, which is why it's often translated modest. Not seeking to draw attention to self. Can it be overdone where someone's crippled with a sense of modesty? I suppose, where I don't ever want, they're just totally into themselves. To some degree, that could actually, oddly enough, have its roots in pride. But that still, I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to be the commanding presence and everybody look at me type approach. And again, we're dealing within the services. I think general rule, I suppose that's a good rule of thumb for all of us, but we're talking about in the church services. So a woman might be gifted, and I use that affectionately, gifted with a vibrant personality. You ever been around someone that just light up the room? They're just fun to be around. They just talk. People like them and laugh. It's one of the things that first attracted me to Tammy, was she just lit up the room. Everybody thought she was fun, which was true. And it just was vibrant. She just had an excitement about her, and that was very attractive. Just not in the church service. There's where we're bringing it back to its limit. It's not saying then you have to be dull and drab in your personality then in every situation, but not in the church service. It's not supposed to be drawing attention to themselves. They're to be modest. And that looking down picture, and they're not seeking to draw attention here, it is reference to their clothing also. The clothing doesn't say, look at me. How do you interpret that? I don't know if we're going to come up with a great standard, but that is certainly what we're aiming at when we're picking what we're going to wear. Off to the left, they are not to dress in such a way as to stand out because of how they dress. Should we dress nice? Yes. But do I want to just stand out? No. By how I dress. This is within the church gatherings. Church gatherings are not to be places of competing dress styles. You would think, well, yeah, but I think many of us who have some years behind us know that this is a problem in our churches. That to some degree it is a place of competing dress styles. Who's better dressed than the other? Now, I think it can go the opposite way also? Absolutely. Where who's the most poorly dressed, however we want to take that one, could also be an issue in a church service. There's nothing noble either, as I started with, in being dull and drab necessarily in how one adorns himself. Point E, so the next word is discreetly. It's sophrosune, which is plainly soundness of mind. That sensible word we read in Titus. Soundness of mind is how she's to adorn herself. Boy, this is a good one. This really should fly in the face of those guys who think, well, of course women have to be submissive to men. They're not as smart, as sensible as men. Well, they're already commanded to be sensible. We could use the word smart also. Well-informed, well-taught. They are to be sensible. And this should be a demonstration of their godly character. It's a very attractive thing. It ought to be well-taught and to be intelligent and be able to converse intelligently about things. There's nothing beautiful necessarily about a woman being particularly naive about everything. Simple. No. This would be opposite to that. She's to adorn herself discreetly, that soundness of mind. They are to be keenly conscious of the purpose then of these meetings and what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Instead, a woman that's sensible, truly aware, truly intelligent of what these times are about, they would cringe to be a distraction. They would cringe to be a distraction. They are to then be clear-headed. And that's why they understand what these times are for. I've said this before, but it's one of the reasons why we're a little careful about whether or not we cause distractions during this time. Some are unavoidable. I understand that. Absolutely unavoidable. It's interesting. Oftentimes the coughing fits will come during church, and you try to restrain it, then it only gets worse, or something falls or whatever. That's okay, but we try to not be a point of distraction. Again, not because we want to be respectful of the speaker, but because of what we're doing here. we're all accountable to this. We're reviewing, going over, learning, focusing on the Word of God, whether or not it's given in a way we necessarily like, or by a person whose suit jacket may not be as interesting as we would like. I'm just jesting now. No, we understand what's going on, so we're trying to be very careful not to be a distraction, and certainly the biggest area is in one's demeanor. So, point F, these being what they are, all these words together, they're dress standards for these times. They are not to adorn themselves in these meetings with, since they know what they're really supposed to be characterized in their adornment, then their adornment should not be characterized with braiding or braided hair, gold or pearls or costly attire. Is there anything wrong with braided hair? Is there anything wrong with gold or pearls? Is there anything wrong with costly attire? No, no, no. That's not the point. The point is, this had better not be what defines your beauty. Your beauty had better be defined and demonstrated in church services with godly character. Godly character. That's the point of the text. But that's what stands out. That's what jumps out. And I think we kind of get it in a multitude of ways. One way is it's easy for someone to look good. But they're not good. They're not good. It happens a lot. Quite often, and just using the illustration of women, so often a young man will be taken with a young lady and how physically attractive she is. Very attractive. Only to find out what's on the inside is not so good. She's not nice. She's not godly. She's selfish. She's arrogant. She's vain. She's lazy. It could be all kinds of things. I'm just using it as an example. And you start to realize, wow, beauty is more than just surface. It really is more than that. And so it should be with the women in the church adorning themselves. No, with the adornment needs to have a whole different focus rather than how well you've done your hair and then your clothing as that being the predominant thing. What stands out more than that is your godly character. And then it doesn't matter, how our physical appearance improves or unimproves, degrades throughout life. Our beauty is demonstrated in the character and obedience. This looks to have been a practice among some of the elite at the time, that in the braiding of their hair, gold and pearls would be intertwined, and extravagant display of wealth, and so attention-getting. I don't just braid my hair. I add stuff to it. And that's what's going to get the attention. As far as their wealth, in the case of gold and silver. Often left again, this is not forbidding to wear costly clothing or jewelry, just not in the church so as to stand out above others. You might have something that's just really nice, and you might think, well, I'm not going to wear this to church. And the reason you're not going to wear it to church is I don't want to be a distraction. I would never want to make it look like I was better than someone else. That's not my motive to determine what I'm wearing. We ought to dress nice. We ought to look good, as I've mentioned. I think it's an honoring in keeping with what this time is. I think we ought to do. But that is never the stress point for us. Point G, one more note on this. This is not a case for a standard for women to be as plain and dull as possible, as I started with. For this, too, would be a distraction. This, too, would be a distraction. We might think, boy, when you get up in the morning, most of us, I would say all of us, let me be generous, because I think I'm safe there, pretty much 100% sure that when we got out, somewhere in the process, before we left the house, we looked in the mirror. We looked in the mirror. And I did. And it's a good thing. I took care of it. My hair was in total disarray. I imagine the hairstyles today I might have fit in with the younger group, though all of my children would have been burning with embarrassment. But yeah, my hair was in total disarray. And I was just pale, tired. I certainly wasn't good looking. And it needed some work. So why do it? Why'd you comb your hair, Don? Why'd you put on a suit jacket? Why'd you wear a tie? Why'd you do this? Also not to be a distraction. Also to try to dress neatly and appropriately so as not to be a distraction, because it would be easy to look as sickly and unhealthy as possible. Granted, sometimes we are sickly and unhealthy, and we just can't do much with it. But if we can, we try to not draw too much attention, because it would be easy to do that, to speculate just a little bit, to just look as down as possible so people will start to notice me and come up, are you okay? Are you all right? And we just want attention that way, just to use another illustration there. The goal is to avoid excess in any of these areas, especially considering the next verse that's coming. Out of respect for the assembling, then dress nicely, dressed sensibly, and then when you're going to demonstrate your adornment, then actively, on purpose, let your adornment be seen for what it is. And that's that godliness of life, godliness of character. Let that be the predominant thing in these church services. Plainly stated, I tried to step into it firmly, dealing with exactly what it's talking about, trying to deal with a lot of the misconceptions, but then exactly what it's talking about here as far as what the adornment should be, and we will build on that next time. Then what does that look like? And this is a beautiful picture here that's often missed because of a reaction, an unnecessary reaction to this particular text. Let's pray. Father, you know better than any of us how susceptible we are to our own opinions, our own sense of things, our own distorted value system focused on self. Please let texts like these refocus us always, constantly leading us not to trust ourselves, but to lean on your word, and looking to constantly be those aware of what's being said and obedient in it. This, Father, of course, comes by your grace, the working of your Spirit within us, and for that we are grateful. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.